When Western atheists want to criticize Christianity, they'll often talk about empirical methods, and empiricism becomes something that's separate from and opposed to the religious mentality. Some Christians also square off and accept this and say, okay, we have a realm that's based on faith, revelation, magic, and on the other hand, you have a realm of knowledge that's based on things that can be observed, things that you can see and hear and ultimately measure, quantify, create scientific textbooks out of it. So some Christians basically accept the opposition that atheists want to engage in when they're criticizing Christianity, and some will reject it on one grounds or another. The very strange game that's gone on with Buddhism and some other Eastern religions has been to try to argue that Buddhism itself is an empirical religion, that Buddhism is based on science or scientific attitudes. You can read some really crazy statements that the Buddha himself was a scientist, was a medical doctor, that his attitudes were 100% rational and scientific, with very carefully selected quotations from here and there in the Pali Canon. Whether or not you sympathize with that direction, it's worth thinking about what's wrong with it and how it relates to that broader question of empiricism and science and modernity. The idea of the empirical comes out of a medical concept in ancient Greece, that instead of working from theories to select the correct treatment, a doctor would work from examples tried in the past, trial and error, producing remedies that work. And when you consider what you mean by theory in the ancient world, it's things like theories of the humors, theories of the colors, theories that you can diagnose someone based on abstract principles that we now know to be false, and that sometimes in the ancient world really had their origins in myth. However, the relationship between empirical experience and religion has always been complicated by a few factors. When people declare, if only the public in America today, if only the public could have empirical attitudes, then we wouldn't have this conflict with religion. If only people could have empirical attitudes, various social values and virtues would result, they think or they hope or they wish. Sadly, it's not true. The attitude is, the expectation is, if only you would believe in what you can see, then the world would change. If only you could believe the evidence before your eyes and be dissatisfied with the fact that, of course, God never shows up, that most religious claims have no visible proof behind them. I think it's only lately that people have felt confident enough to really put this forward, while ignoring the fact that if you spend time with people of religious conviction, they don't feel any conflict about believing in what they see, because they do see what they believe. They believe in things and they see them. There are people who believe in ghosts and they have seen ghosts. Now, whether you choose to call that a hallucination or a dream or some other kind of experience, from their perspective, their empirical perspective, that's something they see and they know directly. This idea is discussed and debated back in the original definition of the meaning of the word skepticism. I wish more people who call themselves skeptics would actually read ancient texts like Sextus Empiricus and realize where this intellectual tradition comes from. But the ancient skeptics were very concerned with the fact that the senses were unreliable. What you see and what you hear can't be trusted. That isn't a simple source of rational ideas. It's quite complicated. A totally modern critique of empirical experience is the philosopher Karl Popper. Karl Popper is 100% pro-science, anti-religion, also anti-communist, and against an overly theoretical approach to the world. However, he was also critical of the ways in which empirical experience can lead us to conclusions that are actually unscientific. So, you know, like everything worth talking about, it's a lot more complicated once you start to dig into it. How has it been that in the last 100 years, and especially since the end of World War II, so many Buddhists have been promoting this notion of Buddhism as a religion that doesn't rely on faith, as Buddhism as a religion with no supernatural ideas, as Buddhism as being the so-called Tao of physics, Buddhism as being some kind of exception to the rules about the conflict between what's empirical and what is religious. Well, there are passages in the ancient texts where Buddhists say, come on, you have to believe what you see with your own eyes. That's true. And the same texts from the same ancient period of time and the same canon and spoken by the same people will also tell you that they have seen ghosts themselves, that they have seen demons, that they have seen people being tortured in hell, that they have seen dialogues with Indra, the god of ancient India, dialogues between the Buddha and Indra. Various other monks also went up to heaven and had a dialogue with Indra. And hallucinatory experience is part of the core practice of meditation that is described in the Pali Canon. You have detailed dialogues with the Buddha from monks who are followers of the Buddha. Sometimes they report very specific things like, well, you know, I'm having these visions of the other world, the heavens, and so on, but I'm not hearing the sounds. You know, why is that? And the Buddha gives an answer. Oh yeah, okay, you've achieved purification of the eye, but not purification of the ear, so you're only getting part of the experience when you see these other realms. And you have dialogues between the Buddha and monks or his followers who complain that they're doing everything right, but they're not having this supernatural experience, which is also interesting. It's interesting that you get complaints against Buddhist orthodoxy preserved inside the texts that define and describe Buddhist orthodoxy. That is an interesting difference between Buddhism and other religions. However, I've got to tell you, the movement to frame the Buddha as a rational, scientific thinker, to frame Buddhism as a skeptical religion, has relied on fraud. Whether it's pious fraud or not is immaterial to me. It's been intellectually dishonest, and it's relied on quoting a little piece of text here and there and saying, "Oh, don't read the paragraph before it or after it. Don't read the whole book." You know, I think that the Buddha did preach, and there are different contexts in which he preaches, that people should believe in what they see and what they know directly for themselves. It also is abundantly obvious that the Buddha felt confident in a magical worldview that embraced demons, hell, heaven or heavens, and many gods. It was a very magical universe that he thought he was living in. And, you know, that he encouraged his followers to continue to believe in that magical world. He was not teaching them to be skeptical of it or to reject that world. Although at the same time, he was teaching them to be skeptical of, for example, the caste system, to reject the justifications for social inequality that weren't ancient. There are also texts, some of which I've quoted in articles, where he's skeptical of racism and the idea that black people are inferior, dark-skinned people within India are inferior. There are many, many cultural ideas that he was skeptical of. He's completely skeptical of the authority of the Vedas, the ancient texts of Hinduism. However, as with many important thinkers in history, the fact that you have original and innovative ideas in one area does not mean that you reject ideas in another area. Contrary to popular belief, Isaac Newton, who was an innovator in science, remained steadfastly and profoundly Christian, and he liked to lecture British Parliament about his views on Christianity and his crazy theories about the history of the world and the descendants of Adam and Eve and how they moved all over the world. So many great scientists were religious eccentrics. It's very well preserved for history. But in the case of the Buddha, he's not a scientist. He is a religious leader who has religious views. And I think it's rather shameful for people to try to suppress the evidence of what those views were in the name of protecting and promulgating that religious tradition. So, what is the future of Buddhism? If nobody today, or fewer and fewer people, let's say nobody, if nobody is motivated to study these texts because they believe that if they don't, they'll go to hell, what's the future of Buddhist philosophy? If people aren't motivated to memorize and recite these texts because they think it'll help them go to heaven after they die, or they think it'll help them achieve nirvana in this lifetime, what is going to motivate sincere scholarship of these texts? I'm going to give you two answers. One, it is not going to be a fraud claiming that the core of these texts is completely rational, completely scientific, and completely skeptical in its attitudes. That fraud will not take you very far. And in the last 50 years, the game has been played out. Two, don't compare the situation of Buddhism today to a failure, to the religions that have died and disappeared. Let's compare it to something successful. Let's compare it to Shakespeare. Nobody is agonizing about the study of Shakespeare disappearing from this world. There are thousands of people who are dedicated experts in the scholarship of Shakespeare, and there are hundreds of thousands who are not experts, but who care enough that they study and have a level of expertise above and beyond the average person. And then there are millions of people for whom Shakespeare is part of their culture. It's part of what's meaningful in their life. It's part of what's enjoyable and entertaining in their life. And then there's a limit. There are millions more who are not interested in Shakespeare, think Shakespeare is boring, and that's fine. Nobody's pulling their hair out over the future of Shakespeare. Shakespeare's got movies, Shakespeare's got books, he's got poems, people are going to read them, people are going to enjoy them. The Shakespeare industry is doing fine. And guess what? Nobody is engaged in the cultural production of Shakespeare because they think that if they don't, they'll go to hell. Nobody thinks that Shakespeare contains the secret to get them in heaven after they die. And to my knowledge, nobody is obsessed with creating the fraud that Shakespeare had completely modern scientific values secretly that have been concealed by corruptions and later additions to his text by other authors or by people with other perspectives trying to somehow censor him and make it into a riddle. So, if the future of Buddhism is going to be meaningful, it can't be based on concealment of evidence. It can't be based on an attitude of censoring what the myths and legends really are. And on the other hand, if you don't have the confidence that this philosophy is worth reading to the same extent that Shakespeare is, that Buddhism can't be meaningful and important in Asian culture the way Shakespeare is meaningful and important in European culture, then this discussion isn't worth having. And for you, the future of Buddhism isn't worth fighting.